We're going to go and get started tonight in our family Bible study. We're in John chapter 5, beginning in verse 1, going through verse 15. And in this account is where Jesus heals a lame man that has been lame for 38 years. And he's going to heal him, telling him to take up his bed and walk. And I love this account that we are studying. And we're glad that you're here tonight to be able to study God's Word with us. Mike, Glenda, glad to see you on here, as well as Amy Summers, glad you're here with us as well. John chapter 5, beginning in verse 1, going through verse 15. We call this in our chart, our chronological chart. And if you don't have that, you can find it on our website, cocmilestone.com, and download that chart. As we're studying the life of Christ in chronological order, we understood that Matthew was called by Jesus as he was going into Capernaum, and as he did so, Matthew ended up preparing a feast in which the sinners and publicans, along with Jesus' disciples, were there eating. And we understand that John's disciples were present as well, because the next event that took place was after the Pharisees questioned why would Jesus eat with publican sinners. They came to him wanting to know, why did Jesus' disciples not fast? And so we studied that last week, and then this week we're in John chapter 5. Now, in John 5 is actually recorded a part of this Galilean ministry that we don't have in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now, remember, we have 4 gospel accounts. Now, I mentioned this previous in some of our studies. There is only one gospel. I want to be very clear of that, and that is the gospel of Jesus Christ. But the word itself just means, gospel means good news. Now, when you think of this, as far as the 4 gospel accounts, sometimes people say, well, the 4 gospels. Remember, just one gospel, but they're 4 accounts. And when we think of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're sometimes referred to as the synoptic gospels because they have so many parallels. And then John is excluded from them, where he does parallel sometimes, but not as much. Now, what's interesting about this account of the Galilean ministry that takes place here in Jerusalem is that you do not have this account being recorded in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. You only have it being recorded in John. The picture that we're putting before you is actually painted by James Tissot. That sounds French to me. He was a French painter that lived from 1836 to 1902. And I'm not even going to try and pronounce that official name of it, but it's called the Pool of Bethesda. And it was painted somewhere between 1886 and 1894. And it really depicts the scene very well, and we're going to notice that a little bit later as we notice the account. But it's in this account that John introduces a very powerful illustration of Jesus' power to heal and a revelation of his divine personality. It also assists us in tracing the rising tide of Jewish hatred towards Jesus. No matter what good Jesus would do, there were those that were going to reject him. And we'll talk about that more in the application as we go. As we keep going in our study, good to have you with us, Sister Letkins, the Lockridge family, Mike Camp, Eva Burleson, Marilyn Brantley. Glad to have you all with us. We're in John chapter 5, beginning in verse 1, going through verse 15. If you have your Bibles, follow along with me. You may be able to read it on the screen in front of you as we read this account. It says, after this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is at Jerusalem by the sheep market a pool, which is called in the Hebrew tongue Bethesda, having 5 porches. In these lay a great multitude of impotent folk, of blind, halt, withered, waiting for the moving of the water. For an angel went down at a certain season into the pool, and troubled the water. Whosoever then first after the troubling of the water stepped in was made whole of whatsoever disease he had. And a certain man was there which had an infirmity 38 years. And when Jesus saw him lie, and knew that he had been now a long time in that case, he saith unto him, Wilt thou be made whole? And the impotent man answered him, Sir, I have no man, when the water is troubled, to put me into the pool. But while I am coming, another steppeth down before me. Jesus saith unto him, Rise, take up thy bed, and walk. And immediately the man was made whole, and took up his bed and walked. And on the same day was the Sabbath. He goes on and says, the Jews therefore said unto him that was cured, it is a Sabbath day. It is not lawful for thee to carry thy bed. He answered them, he that made me whole, the same said unto me, take up thy bed and walk. And then asked they him, what man is that which said unto thee, take up thy bed and walk? And he that was healed wist not who it was, for Jesus had conveyed himself away, a multitude being in that place. Afterward Jesus findeth him in the temple, and said unto him, behold, thou art made whole, sin no more, lest a worse thing come unto thee. The man departed, and told the Jews that it was Jesus which made him whole. Now there's several things that I want to think about in this, because when we consider a text, it's important to understand the context and exactly what's taking place. And so I want to know some of the historical aspects of it, as well as maybe more of the details. And then towards the end of the lesson, I want to make some application, because I think there's a lot of good application that we can make here. One of the questions I'm going to ask you real quick, though, is if you had to define what a porch is. Now, I realize we got folks from Kentucky, from Tennessee, we got folks in Georgia, from Mississippi, from Florida, and even out there in Missouri. If you had to define what a porch is, in this text we have that it mentions the pool having 5 porches. What is a porch? I'm going to give you time to answer that, because we're trying to work with this delay that we sometimes have. So the question that we want to start with tonight is, what would you say the porch is? But now, in chapter 5, beginning in verse 1, the part that we want to notice is, it says, there was a feast of the Jews. Now, some people would question and say, well, what feast is this? Now, it depends on the manuscripts that are being used on whether the article a or the is supposed to be there. Now, when you think about it, if it was the Passover, then it's going to really have a bearing on how long was the ministry of Jesus. And so there are many people that are going to say, well, it was the Passover, but then others are going to say, well, it could be another feast, perhaps one of the Feast of Pentecost, the Feast of Tabernacles, maybe the Feast of Dedication, or the Feast of Purim. And so which feast is it? Ultimately, I'm going to tell you, we don't necessarily know for sure. But a very strong case is suggested, and Foster in his book talks about this, and he says that there's really 4 powerful reasons to suggest that this is the Passover when people would have come. The first that he puts on here is that Jesus had cleansed the temple at the preceding Passover, and then he has an extended ministry in Judea that followed. The trip through Samaria and the area campaign in Galilee followed that. And then if you think of John 4:35, shows it was about the last of December when he was at Sychar, which was a feast that would take place 4 months before the harvest. Now, when you think about this would immediately rule out the idea of the Feast of Tabernacles, the Feast of Dedication. That latter was about December 25th and was not commanded in the Old Testament, but instituted by the Jews to commemorate the rededication of the temple by Judas Maccabeus after it had been defiled by Antiochus. Now, I may have mispronounced that, but y'all bear with me. Purim was normally in February, was a feast which the Jews established to commemorate the rescue of the Jews in Persia by Esther. Now, this feast, if it wasn't Pentecost, the Feast of the Passover, I believe perhaps this one could have been it, because there's a little phrase in there that talks about how he didn't know who Jesus was because he kind of moved himself on, and it refers to the idea of the crowding of the people. And so some people think about this feast of Purim, and it was a very festive event that was unlike the other feasts that they would have, as far as a lot more ruckus and joyous occasion that they would often give to this particular feast. So we don't really know which feast it was, but we do know for certain that it was a feast observed by the Jews, and that's why Jesus had come to Jerusalem. All right. Now, we say he was there in Jerusalem by the sheep market, a pool, which is called in the Hebrew tongue Bethesda, having 5 porches. Now, I asked you a minute ago, what is a porch? And so we're going to see here what your answers are. Amanda says where people sit. That's a pretty good answer. Judy Reynolds, a deck or a patio. Michael Patno says like an entryway to the pool. All right, Michael. My dad says where family and friends meet in communion with God's garden as a background. Oh, very poetic the way you said that, Daddy. Anthony Giuliano says, an area outside the front of a house where there are seats and tables for people to hang out. Sounds like a good place to be. Patricia Shaw says, an area at the front or rear of the house before entering the door. All right, so all of those answers are helping us kind of lay out what typically is a porch. Now, the word in the Greek that we're going to get for porches actually comes from the idea of a portico. And in fact, portico is actually still used in some languages for the concept of the porch. And in the Greek, it actually means a place of standing. And so it's a waiting place that you would have. Now, what we have done in our cultures is oftentimes we will use a porch as a welcoming place, as an area to gather around. Now, sometimes I use my porch when I want to greet somebody, be nice to them, but I don't want them in my house. And so what I'll do is I'll meet them, I'll stand there. Now, if I actually want to spend a little time with them, I might say, all right, have a seat and join me on the porch, and we might sit down. But normally the porch is a waiting place, and in the Greek here, it's the idea of a place standing. Now, this particular pool that they're at is known as Bethesda. And I got a map of Jerusalem that I'm putting before you. And that map is an overview of Jerusalem that comes from the 1st century. Now, we need to realize in 1st century, it is much larger than it would have been during David's times. And the map that shows the terrain, the topographical, is on there for you as well. And you notice how the city of David was much smaller. Because 1st century, you had Jerusalem being about 400 acres and a population that has been variously estimated to be between 20 and 50,000 residents. Now, you start thinking about that. It's said that the walls around it were perhaps 3.5 miles, according to Josephus. So you have a place about 400 acres with 20, 50,000 residents. That's a pretty big place. Now, when you take that, the population would swell any time that there's a festival or a feast. And so when we start thinking about this, you had more than just one pool there. You actually had the pool of Siloam, but this was actually going to be a reference to the pool of Bethesda. And so we try and highlight that for you so you can see that area on the map for you. All right, I'm trying to watch my comments as well. The next chart that we have for you I found intriguing. It's not the full city of Jerusalem for you, but if you look where the number 1 is, that was Herod's mausoleum that was built. We won't go in order. I want to go to number 7 because that would be Golgotha, the place of the skull that where Jesus would be crucified. Number 2 was a fortress that was built to hold the Roman garrison. You had another pool, number 3 there, that was the Struthian pool. 5 is that upper city, was number 6 being Hezekiah's pool up there. But 7, number 4 there is Bethesda's pool. And you kind of see the idea of the porches that were around it. Now, the porches would be those areas around, as we talked about, and the standing areas for the people that would be around the pool. Now, the next images that we have for you are actually the excavations that took place of the pools in Jerusalem, spoken of here in John chapter 5, 1 through 9. And they say that the 5th portico has long been regarded as symbolic, actually cutting across the middle, separating the 2 pools that were known as the pool of Bethesda. And so that's the idea of the 5 porches. And I think that picture shows it. Normally you would have had just 4 walls, but because of the one that goes across, that's why they refer to that as being the 5 porches. All right, so hopefully that helps you understand. I found that very intriguing to see. The next picture that you see is some more excavation that was taking part up there. And then the name itself means House of Mercy. It's located along the eastern wall of the city inside Lion's Gate. Now, I found this part interesting, is that at the Second Temple period, it was a rainwater reservoir that might have been 26 to 32 feet deep. Now I want you to think about that for just a minute, because in our text, it talked about how all these lame people, the ones that couldn't walk, the ones that had all these ailments, they would be thrown into this pool that at one point it is thought was a depth of 26 to 32 feet deep. I found that kind of interesting. In the 5th century, the Byzantine empress built a basilica over the pool, and it talks about the remains and the excavations. The next picture is a view of some of the arches over the pool of Bethesda, where Jesus healed the paralyzed man, and give you a little close-up of some of the intricate stonework that they did in the building of it. All right, so maybe that helps you understand the pool of Bethesda just a little bit more. Let's get back to our text now. So it says there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. We don't know what feast for sure, possibly being the Passover. And this would have made Jesus' ministry just a little over 3 years long. Now there is at Jerusalem by the sheep market a pool, which is called in the Hebrew tongue Bethesda, having 5 porches. We discussed those porches, with the one that goes through the middle, kind of dividing the pool in half. Now in these lay a great multitude of impotent folk, of blind, halt, withered, waiting for the moving of the water. And so you start thinking about that. Some translations say the lame, the sick people, and the paralyzed. And it says, for an angel went down at a certain season into the pool and troubled the water. Whosoever then first after the troubling of the water stepped in was made whole of whatever disease he had. Now, you don't have anywhere in Scripture that speaks of this. Now, I'm going to ask you a question real quick. I'll have to pause and let you catch up. So what was the purpose of miracles that you see being performed, not just in the New Testament, but in the Old Testament as well? What was the purpose of miracles being performed in the Old Testament as well as the New Testament? I'm going to give you just a minute to answer that. Who knows? Maybe Uncle Johnny's still on here. He'll want to chime in. What was the purpose when we look to miracles in the Old Testament as well as the New Testament? And I think that's very important for us to understand as we're studying the context here, because in this, what they're trying to say is that it was known to have a miracle happen, the first person to step in the water after the angel troubled the waters. All right, Davis Myers, way to come in there first, to confirm the messenger. Liam says to prove that it was Jesus. And Liam, you're right. In our studies, we've been talking about the purpose of Jesus working miracles was to confirm Jesus. But remember, more people worked miracles in the Bible, or more miracles took place in the Bible other than just by what Jesus would perform. So in this case, yes, it's to prove that he is God. Some don't want to give away too many answers here. Michael Patno says to confirm the word. And then to prove what they were saying is true. That's good. To reveal and confirm God's word. You're right. And so we don't see, well, let me back up. What are some miracles we see in the Old Testament? Let's ask that question. Barbara Randall, so people would believe. You're right. You're very right. Amy Summers, to prove God is who he is. Exactly. Let's think about some miracles in the Old Testament real quick that we could discuss that God used to confirm the message, to show he is who he is, to prove what they were saying is true. Evan put on here, wow, you were verbose, Evan. I had to hit see more for yours. Miracles always revealed or confirmed something regarding the will of God. Commonly, it confirmed the legitimacy of a speaker's message. All right, very good. Very good. Well put, Evan. Wherever you went to school, that's a good school right there. Parting of the Red Sea, Michael Patno put, yes, that would be a miraculous event. Judy Reynolds had mentioned about that. Liam says water coming from the rock. And Amy Summers, the burning bush. I'll add to that was not consumed by fire. And so it was to show Moses that, yes, he is God. The 10 plagues, that would definitely be correct. In the Old Testament, they were used to lead people back to the God of Israel from worshiping other gods. That's correct. Patricia Shaw, healing the sick. Can we think of an example in the Old Testament of healing the sick? I got one in mind. Let's see here. All right, in the New Testament, the walking on water, Barbara Randall, certainly there. The raising the dead, most certainly, Joe, you're right. Sarah giving birth, yes, you are exactly right, because she even laughed at, she was beyond childbearing years. Marilyn put part in the Red Sea. You're correct there. I keep waiting for a doodad. That's my dad, by the way, Larry Montgomery, doodad. Y'all can start calling him doodad on here if y'all want to. Let's see, wasn't there a leper in the Old Testament that dipped himself 7 times in the river? Y'all remember who that one was? That was the healing of the sick. I hear Ray yelling it out in there, but I'm going to let one of y'all answer that question. Ooh, the case with Enoch and Elijah. Yes, very much so. Elijah praying for fire to burn sacrifice. Oh, I love that one too. Elijah raising the widow's son. Hey, Jeff, good to have you on here too. Armies fleeing from God's sounding an attaching army. Okay, that's a good one. I knew he'd come up with a good one. All right, so all these. Oh, we're still waiting on. Who was the leper? Who was the leper that dipped himself into the river? Elijah and the prophets of Baal, and I highly recommend. Thank you there, Evan. Naaman, there you go, Micah. Way to come in through. You get to pass a class this quarter, evidently. All right, the conquest of Jericho's wall. That's a great one as well. All right, so lots of miracles that took place, acts that would defy nature, go against the laws of nature, that can only be done by the power of God. Now, I know there's going to be some folks, Amy came in through with Naaman, Marsha Kelly, good job. Now, there's going to be a lot of people that talk about miracles today, but we know miracles have ceased, 1 Corinthians chapter 13. But sometimes people use phrasing like the birth of a baby is a miracle. Wow, what a miracle. But y'all, that's not a miracle. That was not, that's something that happens every day that follows the design that God has created. Is it an amazing thing, the way God has designed for procreation to take place? Yes. And a child coming to this world is a remarkable thing. But we got to remember, a miracle defies the laws of nature, the laws of creation that God set in order, and can only be done by the power of God. Now, if somebody was to step into this water and be healed after the angel troubled the water, then yes, that would be a miracle. Just like Naaman going to the river, dipping himself 7 times, there was no power in that miracle. There's no power in the water. The power was in God in executing that miracle. The same as whenever Moses would be able to reach his hand in and it becomes out and it's leprous. He reaches it in again and now it's healed whole. That was only by the power of God that Moses could see that he is the I am. But now, when we take this a case in John chapter 5, what we need to realize is that this is not necessarily actually an angel coming down and a miracle taking place. This is more of a situation of a superstition. Now, I would put that forward to what I would say is the way we can prove that is, one, we have nothing in Scripture telling us about this other than Jesus acknowledging the superstition that they had. Furthermore, Foster puts forth 3 reasons that this is not consistent with the way that miracles work in the Bible. First, he says the miracles of the Bible are always connected with the delivery of a specific message to be able to carry out a specific purpose. 2, this method would have enabled the rich who can employ assistants to secure miraculous aid before the poor, which is not consistent with miracles. 3, there was a period of 400 years of silence since the close of the Old Testament, and the fact that John the Baptist didn't work any miracles that we know of places a profound emphasis upon the miracles of Jesus. And this emphasis is lost if miracles were being performed all the time in the area of this pool in Jerusalem. Now, there's nothing to show us that this actually was taking place. What we do have is Jesus acknowledging that there was a superstition of this time, that when the water would be troubled, the first one to put his foot in the pool, to step into the pool, would be healed. But y'all, we don't really have anything to verify that that actually takes place, other than they believed it would. What we do have, and we don't need to lose the meaning of this passage, is that we have the power of God because Jesus is God, John chapter 1, verse 1 through 14. And he becomes flesh, and he is able to tell this man to take up his bed and walk. Now you think about that, 38 years he has been a paralytic. And y'all, I don't want to take away from people in any shape or form that are paralyzed. But can you imagine how awful it would be to suddenly be paralyzed in this life? And then, and we have it a lot better today than people used to, because today there are, and again, I'm not taking away from it, but today we have all sorts of technologies to try and help people to be able to function normally, as normal as possible in society, even if you're paralyzed. But during these times, they didn't have all that. And for 38 years, he's been paralyzed. And so Jesus asked him, wilt thou be made whole? Now, the man at this point in time doesn't recognize who Jesus is. He doesn't recognize him as the Christ. Now, this is important, because what's going to happen is that Jesus is going to tell him, take up thy bed and walk. Now, the man was thinking, how can I be healed? Because I don't have anybody to put me in there. He couldn't follow this superstition. He couldn't follow this procedure, so he's not seeing any hope. And Jesus says, take up thy bed and walk. And it says, immediately the man was made whole and took up his bed and walked. And on the same day was the Sabbath. Now, isn't that an amazing thing? Y'all, if I lay in the floor too long, I can't just get up and walk. This man for 38 years has been paralyzed. Jesus says, take up thy bed and walk, and then it's done. That's a miracle. Now, y'all, this didn't require any faith on the part of the paralytic man. He was made whole before he did anything, and he didn't believe on who Jesus was. How do we know that? Because the Jews would ask him, look at this, where are we? Verse 10, it's not lawful for thee to carry thy bed. He answered him, he that made me whole, the same said unto me, take up thy bed and walk. And then asked they him, what man is that which said unto thee, take up thy bed and walk? And he that was healed wist not, he knew not who it was. He did not even know this was Jesus. So did the person receiving the healing have to have faith? No, because he didn't even know who Jesus was at this point in time. Isn't that an amazing thing? Because you got all these modern day fake healers or faith healers that are out there, and they're trying to say they can heal people. And then when they don't, they say, well, somebody didn't have enough faith. Well, no, that's not right. That's not correct. Because this man didn't have faith in Jesus at that point, but he was able to stand up and walk. Now, the Jews that were there, it's very interesting that they see this man that for 38 years couldn't walk, and he takes up his bed and walks. And what is their concern? Well, you're doing work on the Sabbath day. Now, that goes back to Exodus, and certainly on the Sabbath day, they weren't to do any work. But you need to realize Jesus was not commanding him to violate the Sabbath day. This wasn't work. This was just violating one of their traditions, their customs that they had as far as what they would classify as work. And remember, we're going to notice here in a few weeks the idea that they would come to Jesus accusing his disciples of working because they plucked some wheat and corn. Now, they weren't violating the Sabbath. They were violating the customs, the traditions that they handed down. Now, I told you this last couple of weeks, but I think it's an important point that we just continually notice in Scripture, is that there's the law of Moses, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And that's the law they were to follow. Y'all, I couldn't fit on my desk the Babylonian Talmud, which holds all the laws that the Pharisees would come up with. All right, so we need to realize Jesus wasn't telling them to violate the Sabbath. They were just upset because he commanded him to violate a rule that they came came up with. Now, we're going to talk about that more here in a minute. And so he doesn't know who it is. He doesn't know who to tell him. And so then he says, Jesus sees him in the temple and said unto him, Behold, thou art made whole. Sin no more, lest a worse thing come unto thee. And the man departed and told for the Jews that it was Jesus which had made him whole. And so he ends up telling them exactly who it was, telling them that it was Jesus. Now, my question to you is, what's worse, somebody being a paralytic or somebody being in sin? Now, think about that. So, what's worse, somebody being paralyzed or somebody being lost in sin? And that's the point that Jesus is trying to make here. And that's the point that we need to take away from this. Yeah, we can see the deity of Jesus in this, because how could he do this thing, this great miracle, if it wasn't for the fact that he was God? The very point pointed out in John chapter 1, verse 1 through 14. But what he wants to explain to him is that there is something that is far worse than being paralyzed, and that's being in sin. Now, do you think we treat it that way? Because, I mean, if I look at it in this world today, is that too many times, if we understood that somebody doing something, all right, I've heard this all my life about don't dive head first into shallow water. Don't dive head first into shallow water. You go to a swimming pool somewhere, they're going to have signs up there telling you, don't dive head first. You don't know how deep that water is. And how many people are going to warn other people, even to the point that if you see shallow water, somebody you don't know is going to jump into it, you warn them. Say, don't do that, shallow water, because you don't want to be paralyzed. But how many times do we watch people living in sin and we don't say a word to them? When Jesus sends a message here, he says, Behold, thou art made whole, sin no more, lest a worse thing come unto thee. All right, let's see here. Anthony Giuliano said, what about the Pharisees? What was it that about the Pharisees followed? Okay, the Pharisees, the Babylonian what? The Babylonian Talmud is a collection that exists of all the different laws that the Jews would create concerning the law of Moses. And man, they would come up with them, all sorts of things. And technically, the Jews continue to change what their dietary restrictions are, even to this day, on there. So hopefully that answers that question you asked. Michael Patno puts, our instinct would be to think about the person rather than their own condition that they are in to begin with. You know, and too many times we look at that which is physical. And y'all, the comparisons to this is rampant today. Think about the coronavirus. And, you know, my mom's on here, and good to see you joining us tonight. I'm glad that you're able to, and I'm glad you're doing better. You know, but she was in she had the coronavirus and was in the hospital. And we're glad that she's able to be home. But, and not at my home, but at somebody else's home. You can laugh at that, Mama. All right, here we go. I don't want people to be sick. I don't want people to be paralyzed. But I'm going to tell you something. Don't you wish our country would become more concerned about people living in sin? Just half as concerned about people living in sin as they are about people getting this virus. I mean, they're shutting things down left and right because we might get sick and we might physically die. And you've seen the numbers of the deaths of people in car wrecks, the deaths of people from the flu, the deaths of heart disease, the deaths of obesity. You can talk about the deaths of people because of abortion. And y'all, people are just so concerned about this virus and these physical things, but yet there are people every day that are dying lost in sin. See, Jesus came, and I can't help but wonder when he walked in Jerusalem and he saw these multitudes and he saw these superstitions, he saw these Pharisees that were self-righteous. You ever think about the pity? You ever think about the sorrow that he had because they could not even recognize and realize their condition? All right, so John chapter 5, 1 through 15, what can we learn? One, one major point I lost that I didn't mention to you is, what about the Pharisees? Not being able to recognize that Jesus was in their presence because they're more concerned about their traditions and whether somebody was following their traditions or not. I sometimes wonder if Jesus was to come into this world and if he was to walk into one of our congregations, would he be accepted or would he be rejected because he doesn't follow one of the traditions that we are trying to implement and hold to and bind upon people? Now, I know that's not a popular point to make in some people, but we got to be careful, because the reason the Pharisees didn't like Jesus was because he would reject their traditions. And here is God in their midst working miracles that ought to cause them to realize, here's the Messiah, here is the Redeemer, here is the Christ. But they rejected him because they're more concerned about their traditionalism. We need to be very careful of that we don't do the same thing as we try and follow Jesus today. All right. Any final questions or comments over this? We can talk about the tradition, being careful not to reject Jesus because of that. We need to be careful of following superstition rather than truth. We need to be careful that we don't realize that we don't see physical ailments and physical things as more important than that which is spiritual. Those would be the three lessons I think we could take away from this. Marilyn Brantley puts, sad thing is that too many people do not even know Jesus, and I agree with you, and they don't, and people will reject him because of their traditions all the time. Sometimes people say, well, I can't recognize that because if that was true, then Mama or Grandma was wrong, and they'll completely reject the truth just because it doesn't fit what they're wanting. Tony Vance, good to see you. We're coming to the end of our study, but go back and watch the rest of it if you want to learn about Jesus healing a paralyzed man. All right, any other comments as we come to a close tonight? Give you just a couple minutes to be able to make those comments if you want to. We appreciate you joining us tonight for a Bible study. I was trying to keep it shorter. I hope I did so tonight. All right, well, we're glad that you joined us.